The first thing the fire ate was the paper. Ruth held it too close to the flame, not by accident, but because William Crenshaw ordered her to. The handwriting was hers, slanted, careful. The letters she taught herself late at night by copying a Bible she was never meant to touch. She had written to her mother, words folded into hope, words that should have crossed miles but instead ended in the master's hand. He read them aloud with a smile sharp as glass, then pressed the page back to her. "Burn it," he said. So she did. The edges curled, ink liquefied, and the fire erased the last trace of her voice. She didn't flinch. She only watched, memorizing how quickly words disappeared when they had no protection. She learned something then. That memory must live elsewhere. The cabin smelled of smoke and iron that morning. Outside, roosters argued with the dawn. Inside, Ruth's face was still, as if her skin were a mask carefully carved. Crenshaw's boots shifted on the floorboards. He liked to stand close, liked the way silence pressed against her when he waited for a reaction. "You think too much," he said. Ruth bowed her head, the way she had been taught, the way survival required. But inside, where the fire could not reach, she was already writing again. Not on paper this time, but in the muscles of her memory, carving lines as permanent as scars. Entry 1. He burned my words. By the time the sun lifted over Rutherford County, the plantation was awake. The air carried the smell of tobacco curing in long wooden sheds, thick and sweet, the kind of scent that clung to lungs and skin. Men and women bent to their work in the fields, their backs moving like tides. Overseers shouted in lazy rhythms, their whips more threat than strike today, but tomorrow could be different. In the big house, Crenshaw's life followed a pattern he mistook for order. He believed himself clever, a man of precision, his plates aligned, his shirts folded with edges sharp enough to cut. He believed discipline was proof of mastery. The world had given him land, a house, and Ruth. What he did with them was his proof of power. At 17, Ruth had been pulled from the rows to serve indoors. A favor, Crenshaw called it, as if a life indoors were freedom. She learned his ways quickly, how he wanted his coffee poured before he spoke, how the mirror on his dresser must be tilted so he saw himself taller. He corrected her constantly, not to improve her, but to remind her. Each correction was a string knotted around her throat, pulling tighter by the day. Still, Ruth observed. She observed how he limped slightly when he thought no one was looking, how his right hand trembled near open flame, how he hated silence long enough for thought to creep in. She studied him with the patience of someone who had nothing but time. And she remembered. Every insult, every stolen letter, every plate slammed down hard enough to startle. She collected them the way a banker collects debts. She could not store them on paper, not yet, but her mind became a ledger with pages that turned easily in the dark. Entry 2. He broke the plate against the wall. I picked up the pieces. He laughed. That evening, as the sun bled itself across the horizon, Ruth carried water into the parlor. The room glowed with lamplight. Shadows stretching across walls hung with portraits of men who believed history would remember them as noble. Crenshaw sat in his chair, boots polished, eyes fixed on her with the slow hunger of a cat watching a mouse it had no need to eat yet. "Sing," he ordered. Ruth's throat tightened. Her mother's songs had once been cradle-warm, stitched with rhythms older than the land. Now they had become commands, stripped of comfort. She sang softly, words she no longer believed in, while Crenshaw leaned back, satisfied not with the music, but with the obedience. When she finished, he clapped once. "Better," he said. She nodded, face calm, voice still. But when she returned to her pallet that night, she whispered the entry to herself before closing her eyes. Entry 3. He made my mother's song his toy. In the weeks that followed, Ruth's world narrowed into rituals of control. Crenshaw gave her tasks designed to fail. Polish a floor until she could see his face in it, then scuff it with his boot. Fold linens into sharp squares, then pull them apart with a laugh. Every failure was staged, every correction rehearsed. But Ruth rehearsed too. In silence, she practiced walking without sound. She practiced lifting objects heavier than they seemed, timing the sway of ropes in the barn when she went for firewood. She practiced listening to the creak of beams, memorizing which ones sagged under weight. Each practice was another entry, invisible ink scrawled on her bones. Entry 4. He told me mercy was for weak men. I told myself mercy could wait. The land itself seemed to conspire with her memory. The fields whispered at night. The barn groaned with old age. The river carried secrets away, but always brought new ones back. Ruth walked among these sounds and stored them in the same place she kept his cruelties. She was building a map, not of escape, but of reckoning. And through it all, Crenshaw never noticed. He believed silence meant submission. He believed stillness meant emptiness. He did not see that still water hides the deepest currents. One night, while he slept heavy from drink, Ruth crept to the fireplace. She pressed her finger into the soot, tracing lines on the underside of a loose floorboard. She wrote the first visible entry of her ledger, crude but hers. The soot smeared under her hand, but the mark stayed. She touched it once, as if sealing a vow. The fire outside had long gone cold, but in her chest, something new was burning. Not words, not songs, not hope. A different flame. And flames, Ruth knew, were patient. The soot mark under the floorboard stayed hidden, black lines against splintered wood, waiting for no one but her. Ruth pressed her palm against it every night before sleep, as if the rough grain could steady her heart. Each touch was a promise. Remember, endure, prepare. In the daylight, the promise became practice. The house was an orchestra of demands, Crenshaw its conductor, and Ruth the first violin forced to play the same bitter notes. He began to test her with smaller cruelties, experiments to measure obedience. One morning he asked her to lace his boots while he sat in his chair, legs stretched arrogantly, the whip handle resting across his knees. Faster, he said. Her fingers tightened the leather strings, her eyes lowered. She could smell the polish on his boots, the sharpness of sweat underneath. He tapped the whip against his palm in rhythm, waiting for her to falter. She didn't. She tied the final knot clean, perfect. Crenshaw leaned forward, tilting her chin up with the whip handle. His smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. You'd make a fine wife if you weren't mine already. Ruth's stomach clenched, but her face was a mask. Silence was her shield. She let him think it meant nothing stirred inside her. But when she returned to her pallet that night, she whispered the words into her secret ledger. Entry 5. He called me wife. He meant possession, not bond. Moses noticed first. He was older, his back bent from decades under the sun, but his eyes were sharp. He watched the way Ruth carried herself, too still, too deliberate. She moved like someone walking across a thin sheet of ice. You got to keep your head low, Moses warned in a hushed voice while they fetched water from the well. That man smelled defiance quicker than smoke. Ruth dipped the bucket into the dark water, letting the rope creak against the pulley. What if smoke's the only way to breathe? She asked. Moses froze, his weathered hands tightening on the rope. He studied her, searching for the meaning behind her words. At last he shook his head. You play in a dangerous game. She didn't answer, but the faint smile that touched her lips was enough to chill him. The ledger grew thicker. Every humiliation was another line carved into memory. Crenshaw staged new lessons in control. He once poured her a glass of wine, held it out, then tipped it over the floorboards before she could touch it. He sent her with a letter to the post, then laughed when she returned. The letter had been blank. He let her taste honey from the jar with the promise she could keep the rest, then fed it to the dogs before her eyes. Each act was small enough that, to outsiders, it would seem trivial. But cruelty, Ruth understood, lived not in size but in repetition. Drops of water hollow stone. Entry 6. He starved me with honey. Entry 7. He made me deliver silence in an envelope. But cruelty could not always stay hidden. One afternoon, as Ruth carried a tray into the dining room, Crenshaw lashed out over some imagined imperfection and struck her across the face. The sound cracked through the room, startling even him. A red welt rose instantly on her cheek. Moses was there, standing in the doorway with a basket of wood. His hands tightened, his jaw clenched, but he didn't move. His eyes met Ruth's, sorrow, apology, resignation. Then he lowered his gaze and walked away. Crenshaw chuckled as if nothing had happened. Learn quick, he said, and went back to his meal. That night Ruth pressed her palm to the soot mark harder than ever, feeling the sting still hot on her face. She didn't cry. She couldn't. Tears would be wasted water. Instead, she added the line to her memory. Entry 8. He struck me where all could see. No one came. Seasons shifted. Winter crept into the fields. frost whitening the ground. The barns groaned under the weight of curing leaves, and the river slowed with ice. Inside the house, the fire burned longer. The room smelled of tobacco smoke and damp wool. Crenshaw's moods soured with the weather. He began drinking earlier in the day. The liquor sharpened his cruelty into new shapes. One evening, he gathered the household workers into the parlor. His eyes glistened, his voice loud and slurred. "Tell me," he demanded, pointing at Ruth. "Who do you belong to?" Her throat tightened. She answered softly, "To you, sir." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Say it louder." She repeated it, louder this time, while the others stared at the floor. Moses's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Crenshaw clapped once, satisfied. "Good. Never forget." Later, when the others shuffled away in silence, Ruth lingered at the doorway, her face calm. Inside, though, the words burned deeper than the letter he had fed to the fire. She knew the truth. Belonging could be undone. Chains could be broken. Entry 9. He made me shout his name like prayer. I whispered my own name louder inside. But tension works like a rope pulled too tight. Eventually, something must give. It happened one afternoon in the barn. Ruth had been sent to fetch kindling. The air was sharp with the smell of hay and dust. Above her head, the beams sagged with age. She set the wood aside and paused, listening. The barn creaked like a living thing, the ropes and pulleys shifting with the weight of the harvest. She looked up at the heavy beam balanced across two posts. One swing of a mallet, one loose knot, and it could fall. She stood still, heart pounding. The thought rose unbidden, dangerous, undeniable. Entry 10. Beams remember weight. So do I. She touched the wood, feeling the vibration, the quiet strength hidden in its fibers. It felt alive, patient, waiting. She wasn't ready, not yet. But she knew now where the story could end. In the weeks that followed, Ruth moved carefully, almost tenderly. She prepared meals, polished silver, mended clothes. To anyone watching, she was obedient as ever. But beneath that calm surface, the ledger thickened. Sometimes, at night, she practiced her own forms of cruelty, not on others, but in her imagination. She would picture Crenshaw begging for water, picture herself holding it just out of reach. She pictured him asking for forgiveness, and her silence answering louder than any word. These visions were rehearsals, a theater she built in the dark. The rehearsals steadied her. They made her ready. One night, she returned to the fireplace with soot on her fingers. She lifted the floorboard and added another line beside the first. She blew the dust away and covered it again. Then she lay down to sleep, her face calm, her breath steady, the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips. Outside, the winter deepened. The fields lay bare, waiting for spring. The tobacco sheds creaked, beams sagging under old weight. In the house, Crenshaw drank more, laughed louder, and never noticed the stillness in Ruth's eyes had sharpened into something dangerous. He mistook her silence for surrender. But silence, Ruth knew, was only the sound before the storm. The morning broke sharp with frost, the kind that etched every fence post in silver. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, thin and blue, curling into a sky still heavy with dawn. Ruth moved quietly, setting out breakfast as she always did. Eggs cooked firm, bread baked hard at the crust, coffee black. Every motion rehearsed, every placement exact. Crenshaw came late, his boots striking the floorboards with a rhythm too forceful, as if he wanted the house itself to know he had arrived. His eyes were rimmed with the glassy sheen of drink, though it was barely past sunrise. He sat without a word, surveying the table like a general sizing a battlefield. Ruth placed the plate in front of him, her face unreadable. He picked up the fork, stabbed at the eggs, chewed once. Then his jaw stilled. He spat the mouthful back onto the plate. "Cold," he said flatly. Ruth opened her mouth to answer, but the plate was already airborne. It struck the wall inches from her head, shattering into white fragments that rained across the floor. The sound cut through the room like thunder, startling the servants gathered nearby. Moses, standing in the doorway with a basket of wood, froze. His eyes darted from Ruth to Crenshaw, then back, before he lowered his gaze and stepped away. Silence followed, the kind of silence that doesn't rest but coils like a snake. Crenshaw leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Clumsy girl. Clean it." Ruth crouched, gathering the shards one by one. Each piece caught the light like a blade. She pressed one into her palm a second too long, letting it bite into her skin. A thin line of blood rose, red against brown. She didn't flinch. Inside her chest, something shifted. Entry 11. The plate broke. So did I? That night, she returned to the barn. The air was colder there, smelling of hay and smoke, the beams above groaning under their weight. She carried no wood, no tools, only herself. Standing beneath the thick crossbeam, she reached up and touched it, her fingers tracing its rough surface. She imagined it falling, imagined the sound of bone breaking instead of china. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from a sudden clarity. She wasn't imagining anymore. The ledger was no longer just memory. It had become a plan. The days that followed unfolded like a tightening noose. Crenshaw's cruelty grew sharper, as if the broken plate had awakened a deeper hunger in him. He found new ways to humiliate, spilling wine across her freshly scrubbed floor, forcing her to kneel and lick it clean while he watched, mocking her attempts at song with laughter that echoed through the halls. Each act was another entry, carved not only in her memory, but now in soot and ink. The ledger under the floorboard thickened. Entry 12. He made me kneel in filth. I rose in silence. But cruelty alone wasn't the turning point. What broke the last barrier was mercy, false mercy, dangled and withdrawn. One evening Crenshaw announced he would allow Ruth to visit her mother's grave, something he had denied for years. Her heart stumbled, hope rushing unbidden through her chest. She nodded, unable to hide the flicker of gratitude in her eyes. The next morning, dressed and ready, she waited by the door. Crenshaw appeared, hat in hand, lips curved in a cruel half-smile. "Changed my mind," he said. "Graves don't need company." Then he walked past her into the yard, leaving the words hanging in the air like a noose. Ruth stood frozen, her body trembling with a storm she could no longer contain. She understood then. Mercy was his sharpest weapon, and it was the one she would turn against him. Entry 13. He killed her twice. Once in flesh, once in memory. That night, Ruth did not touch the soot mark under her floorboard. Instead, she lifted it fully, pulling free the bundle of scraps she had been hiding for months. Torn bits of paper, smudged with soot and ink, filled with the entries she had copied down whenever she dared. Her ledger was no longer invisible. It was real, solid, undeniable. She read the entries aloud, her voice steady in the dark. With each line, the air in the room grew heavier, as if the walls themselves bore witness. When she finished, she pressed the bundle to her chest and closed her eyes. "I will not burn again," she whispered. The next morning, she began rehearsing. In the barn, under pretense of gathering wood, she tested the ropes, adjusted knots, shifted beams by a fraction of an inch. Her hands moved with casual precision, as if she were doing chores, but inside her chest the ledger whispered each step. She imagined him standing there. Imagined his surprise, his cry, the sudden reversal. She could almost hear it, and for the first time, she smiled. But transformation is never quiet. Moses caught her one evening, standing alone in the barn, staring up at the beams with eyes too sharp to belong to someone beaten down. He stepped inside, the lantern in his hand throwing long shadows across the hay. "What you thinkin'?" he asked carefully. Ruth turned, her face calm, her voice soft. "About how things fall." Moses set the lantern down, studying her. "Don't do it. Whatever it is, don't." Her gaze held his. "Why not?" "Because they don't remember us," he said. His voice cracked. "They remember them. And if you do what I think you doin', they'll remember you the way they remember him. Not as truth. As monster." Ruth's lips trembled, but only for a moment. Better a monster remembered than a woman erased. Moses said nothing. His silence was answer enough. He picked up the lantern and walked out, leaving her in shadow. That night, Ruth added a new entry. Outside, the frost thickened, silvering every field. The house slept. The barn groaned. And Ruth lay awake, her eyes open to the dark, her heart no longer whispering but roaring. The plate had shattered more than porcelain. It had cracked the dam of silence she had built for 7 long years. Now the flood was coming, and nothing, not even mercy, would stop it. The winter deepened, turning the tobacco fields into a frozen sea. Every morning Ruth's breath rose in pale clouds as she lit the fires, her hands numb, her movements precise. The house seemed to shrink in the cold, its rooms closer, its walls tighter, its master's moods more unpredictable. William Crenshaw drank more. He stumbled through the halls at odd hours, shouting for things that didn't exist, calling for his dead wife, barking Ruth's name as though summoning a hound. His cruelty no longer had edges. It sloshed out of him, wild and sloppy, spilling over into every interaction. But the danger was not in his rage. The danger was in the moments when he was quiet. Those silences pressed like weights. Ruth felt them even before he entered the room, an invisible tension gathering in the air. When he finally spoke, the words were small but sharp, knives made of whispers. "You think I don't see you," he said once, his eyes narrowed over the rim of his glass. "But I do. Every thought, every flicker. You can't hide from me." Ruth lowered her gaze, but inside, her heart hammered. He was right about one thing. She wasn't hiding anymore. Entry 14. He sees flickers. He does not see the fire. The ledger had grown fat with soot-smeared pages, each one pressed beneath the floorboard like a secret pulse. Ruth added to it each night, the ink of her memory running darker, heavier. But now she no longer wrote only what he did. She wrote what she would do. Entry 15. One day soon, he will drink from my hand. Water or ash, I will decide. The act of writing steadied her. It was like rehearsing a prayer, one she would recite when the moment arrived. Moses avoided her now. He worked in the fields, kept his distance in the kitchen, and when their eyes met, his carried a plea he didn't voice. He knew she was standing on an edge. She knew he would not stop her. Silence was his way of survival, and perhaps, in its own way, of complicity. Once, when the others had gone to bed, Ruth found him sitting outside, sharpening a blade against a stone. The sparks lit his face in brief flashes. "You're set in a fire you can't put out," he murmured without looking at her. Ruth stood behind him, her voice low, calm. "It already burns." He stopped sharpening, the blade resting in his lap. "And when it consumes you too?" She turned away before answering. Better to burn than to rot. The turning came sooner than even Ruth expected. One evening, as snow began to fall heavy, Crenshaw summoned her to the dining room. A half-empty bottle sat before him, his cheeks flushed red, his eyes glassy with liquor. He gestured at the chair across from him. "Sit." Ruth hesitated. Slaves did not sit at the master's table. "I said sit," he snapped. She lowered herself into the chair. The wood felt strange beneath her, wrong. Her heart thudded in her chest. Crenshaw poured 2 glasses of wine, pushing one toward her. She stared at it, but did not move. "Drink," he ordered. Her hand trembled as she lifted the glass. The wine touched her lips, bitter and sharp. He watched her closely, a twisted smile spreading. "See? I can be kind. I could make you more than servant. I could make you mine." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Ruth set the glass down carefully. Inside her, the ledger screamed. Every entry, every wound, every humiliation roared louder than his voice. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her face still. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Crenshaw leaned back, satisfied. He mistook her quiet for surrender, as he always had. He did not see the storm rising behind her eyes. Entry 16. He offered wine. He meant chains. I swallowed flame instead. That night Ruth could not sleep. The house creaked with wind, the shutters rattled, the snow hissed against the windows. She lay staring into the dark, her body still, her mind alight. Images tumbled through her head. The beam in the barn, the ropes she had tested, the sound of the plate shattering, her mother's grave denied, the taste of bitter wine. The ledger whispered to her, every entry pulsing like a heartbeat. She pressed her hand to the floorboard. Soon, in the days that followed, she prepared with the precision of someone baking bread or stitching cloth. She made her movements ordinary, unremarkable. When she passed through the barn, she checked the knots with the casual air of gathering wood. She shifted a beam half an inch, nudged a rope so it would fray when weight pressed it. Each adjustment small, invisible, yet together a design. Her heart no longer trembled when she imagined it. It steadied, but steadiness did not mean ease. At night she lay awake, doubt creeping in like frost under a door. What if she failed? What if he lived? What if his cries brought others, and her name became the only one remembered, not his crimes? She thought of Moses's words, "They'll call you monster." Her throat tightened. Perhaps they would. But was she not already made monstrous by what she endured? By silence, by humiliation, by the theft of her voice? Better to choose her monster than wear his forever. The breaking point arrived on a bitter morning. Crenshaw, drunk before noon, staggered into the kitchen where Ruth was stirring a pot. He leaned close, his breath hot with alcohol, his words slurred. "You're mine," he whispered, pressing his hand against her cheek. "Say it." Ruth froze. The pot bubbled, steam rising between them like a veil. Her skin crawled beneath his touch. "Say it," he repeated louder now. She looked into his eyes. For the first time, she didn't lower her gaze. Her voice came out calm, steady. Not for long. He blinked, confused, his face twisting with anger. But before he could respond, she stepped back, bowing her head as if in apology. The mask slipped back into place. But inside, she knew. The ledger's final page was waiting to be written. That night she returned to the barn one last time. The snow lay heavy outside, muffling every sound. She carried a lantern, its light throwing gold across the beams. She placed it carefully on the ground and looked up at the great weight of wood above her. Her hands touched the ropes, tracing them like strings of an instrument. Everything was ready. The stage was set. Her breath misted in the cold air as she whispered the entry aloud. The morning was quiet, too quiet. Snow lay heavy on the ground, muffling footsteps, muting voices. The house was still, the fields hushed. Inside the barn, breath showed in thin clouds, the air sharp with hay and old wood. Ruth was there before him. She moved with steady hands, arranging tools, stacking wood, everything in place but nothing out of place. The lantern's flame flickered against the beams, shadows stretching tall across the walls. She ran her fingers once more over the rope she had weakened, the knot she had loosened. Everything waited. Her heart did not race. It beat slow, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock approaching the hour. Crenshaw entered, boots crunching on frost. His voice broke the silence. "Girl, where are you?" Ruth stepped forward from the shadows, calm, as though summoned. "Here, sir." He frowned at the sight of her standing so straight, so still, as if she belonged there. "Fetch me the mallet," he ordered, pointing toward the corner. She walked to it, lifted it, felt the weight in her hands. She turned, the mallet balanced easily, her face unreadable. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. "Don't dawdle." The moment stretched thin. Then Ruth swung. The mallet struck the beam support. Wood groaned, rope snapped, dust rained down like ash. With a roar, the great beam above gave way. Crenshaw barely had time to cry out. The weight crashed onto his legs with a sound that split the air, a wet, sickening crack. He fell back, pinned, his cane of authority shattered in a single breath. The barn fell silent again. Ruth lowered the mallet, her chest rising and falling slow. She stepped closer, her shadow crossing his face. His scream broke loose now, raw, ragged, echoing off the walls. "Help me," he shouted. "God, help me." His hands clawed at the beam, his face twisted in terror. He looked up at her, the first time in 7 years that his eyes searched hers not with command, but with need. "Please," he gasped. "Get it off me. I'll give you anything. Freedom. Money. Just help." Ruth crouched beside him. Her face was calm, almost gentle. She poured a little water into a tin cup, held it to his lips. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin. Then she pulled it away before he was finished. Crenshaw choked. "No, don't, please." Her voice was steady low. "You taught me this." From her apron, she pulled the bundle of soot-stained scraps. The ledger. She unfolded it, the pages trembling only slightly in her hands. "October 3rd, she read aloud, her voice cutting through his screams. "You burned my words." Crenshaw's breath hitched. He tried to laugh, but the sound broke into sobs. "That was nothing, just a lesson." "November 12th, Ruth continued, her tone flat as stone. "You spilled honey before me and fed it to the dogs." He shook his head wildly, tears streaking his face. "Please, please, I didn't mean." "December 9th. You promised me my mother's grave. Then you stole it back." Crenshaw covered his face with his hands, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I'll make it right." But Ruth lowered his hands, forcing him to look at her. "You can't. The grave doesn't wait for you." Time in the barn slowed. Ruth's voice was the only rhythm, the ledger her scripture. Each entry she read was matched by his sob, his plea, his desperate denial. She fed him a sip of water, then pulled it away. She adjusted the beam slightly, just enough to send pain surging through his body. His cries grew weaker, his promises emptier. "Mercy," he begged at last, broken. "Mercy." Ruth paused, the ledger trembling in her hand. She stared at him, her breath fogging in the cold air. Then she whispered, "Mercy is mine now." She knelt close, her lips near his ear. "Say it." His eyes darted, confused. "Say what?" Her voice hardened. "Say what you did." He swallowed, shaking. I hurt you. I broke, not enough." Tears pooled in his eyes. His words tumbled out. "I burned your letters. I denied you your mother. I made you less than human." "Say it," she pressed. "All of it." His voice cracked. "I owned you. I made you mine. I took everything." Ruth studied him, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once, the smallest gesture of acknowledgement. She stood, folding the ledger closed. Crenshaw's breathing was shallow now, his face pale with pain, his body trembling. He looked up at her one last time, eyes wide with something Ruth had never seen there before. Not rage, not pride, but fear. "Ruth," he whispered, the first time he had ever spoken her name softly. "Don't let me die here." She looked down at him, her expression calm, her voice even. "You already did." The barn fell into silence again. Crenshaw's last breath shuddered from him, slipping into the cold air. His eyes froze wide, staring at the rafters above, as if searching for salvation in the beams that had betrayed him. Ruth stood over him, the ledger in her hands, her face still. No triumph, no smile. Only a quiet, heavy stillness. She bent, placed the ledger gently on his chest, then drew the lantern closer. The flame flickered, catching the edge of the soot-stained page. Fire licked upward, curling the paper, devouring the ink. She let it burn until the ashes drifted over his still body. Her voice, low, steady. "Now it is finished." Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white. Inside the barn, the smell of smoke lingered, mingling with dust and blood. Ruth stepped out into the cold, the door closing behind her. She walked toward the house, her footprints the only mark on the fresh snow. Her hands were steady, her face calm, her silence louder than any scream. The storm inside her had broken. The silence, at last, was hers. The snow did not stop falling. It covered the farm like a shroud, softening edges, muting sound, burying the traces of what had happened inside the barn. Ruth walked back to the house, each step crisp in the powder, the cold biting her cheeks. Behind her, the barn hunched in silence, holding the weight of a body and the ashes of a ledger. Inside, the house carried on as though nothing had changed. The fire in the hearth crackled, pots bubbled in the kitchen, voices murmured in low tones. Life refused to pause, even when death demanded it. Moses looked up when Ruth entered. Their eyes met across the dim room. He said nothing, but his gaze searched her face as if to confirm what he already suspected. He saw the calm in her eyes, the strange steadiness in her shoulders. He looked away, returning to his work, because silence was the only shelter either of them had left. The news spread slowly. Crenshaw's body was found pinned beneath the beam, his legs crushed, his face frozen in horror. The explanation was easy: accident. A weakened rope, an old barn, a careless misstep. No one questioned it too hard. Men like Crenshaw died all the time, by horse, by tool, by their own drink. The county shook its head, muttered about bad luck, and moved on. No one asked Ruth what she had seen. No one thought to. She was the servant, the shadow, the silent witness. She folded linens, scrubbed floors, and spoke only when spoken to. She was invisible by design, and invisibility was her shield. But in her chest, the ledger still burned. At night, she dreamed of the barn. She saw the beam fall again and again, the sound of its shattering bone echoing through her sleep. She woke with her hands trembling, the smell of smoke still in her nose. She pressed her palm to the floorboard where the soot-marked pages had once been, though the hiding place was now empty. The ledger was gone, but its memory was carved into her like scripture. She didn't need the pages. She carried them in her blood. Entry 17, he is ash. I am not. The weeks turned into months. Spring thawed the fields, green shoots pushing through thawed soil. Work resumed. Tobacco leaves unfurled, wagons rolled. The world refused to stop. And Ruth kept moving. Her hands cooked, cleaned, mended. Her body bent to tasks. Her lips sang when commanded. But beneath the surface, a quiet power pulsed. The storm inside her had not vanished. It had simply reshaped itself into silence again, a silence of her own making this time. Moses kept his distance, but sometimes, when no one was watching, he would nod once in her direction. Not approval, not condemnation, just acknowledgement. A recognition that what had been done could never be undone, and that it had, somehow, set them all a little freer, even if chains still bound their wrists. Years passed. Ownership of the farm shifted hands. New masters came, then went. Ruth remained. She lived long enough that people stopped counting her age, long enough that whispers about the accident in the barn turned into half-forgotten tales. Some said Crenshaw had been drunk. Some said the barn was cursed. Some said his cruelty had finally bent the world against him. No one spoke Ruth's name in those stories. No one thought to connect her silence with his death. And that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. But memory does not vanish just because the world forgets. It lingers in places no one thinks to look. A courthouse clerk, years later, discovered a small bundle of soot-stained scraps tucked into the lining of an old trunk. The words were faded, half illegible, but enough remained. Dates, descriptions, small acts of cruelty catalogued in a steady hand. The ledger lived again, fragile but undeniable. The clerk didn't know what to make of it. He filed it away, stamped it with the rest of the county's forgotten papers, and left it to gather dust. But the words had already escaped. They carried themselves into whispers, into legends told over firesides, into the marrow of a place that wanted to bury its guilt but couldn't. In her final years, Ruth walked slower. Her hair silvered, her body bent, but her eyes never dulled. People said she carried a strange calm, as if she knew something no one else did. Children whispered that she talked to shadows. Men said she laughed at things unseen. On the night she died, the air was heavy with mist. She lay on her pallet, her breath shallow, her hand resting lightly over the old floorboard. Her lips moved in silence, reciting something only she could hear. Perhaps it was a prayer. Perhaps it was the ledger. When morning came, she was gone. The farm outlived her. The barns rotted. The fields changed hands. The big house sagged into ruin. But the story never left. It clung to the soil, to the walls, to the beams still standing in the dust. People said, on winter nights, you could hear the sound of wood splintering in the barn, though no one was inside. They said you could see a woman's shadow in the doorway, standing tall, steady, silent. Some called her a ghost. Some called her a saint. Some called her a monster. No one called her forgotten. And if you stand there now, in the silence of the ruined barn, you can almost hear it. A voice, low and calm, reciting entries that are no longer on paper but written into the bones of the land. October 3rd. He burned my words. November 12th. He fed honey to dogs. December 9th. He stole my mother's grave. February 3rd. The silence ended. The wind carries the words, scattering them like ash. And then the silence closes in again, heavy, powerful,